This this is something to talk about from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. And today we're going to be talking about gardening with Ann Lovejoy. And we're right at one of those inflection points. Autumn equinox is right around the corner. We want to thank Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island for sponsoring something to talk about. They offer innovative and compassionate care on Rolling Bay. They have independent living and assisted living and memory care. They offer day stay and respite programs. I also want to make sure that we acknowledge that we are meeting on the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water. They have been taking care of the waters and the lands along the Salish Sea since time immemorial. We honor them and we are grateful for their hospitality, and we look to heal the wounds of time gone by. And thank you very much for joining us again this month. And I noticed on your blog that you had some thoughts about the coming equinox, which is Saturday.
It is Saturday, and it's, this is one of those interesting, like you said, the swing kind of days between, for us in this part of the world, it's sort of odd. Like June is supposed to be the summer solstice, and we just barely got there for us. And it's not like the peak of summer at all. It's like barely the beginning. And similarly, the autumn equinox often falls before we're quite ready to cop to that, right? But it's kind of fascinating because, there's been obviously a lot of weather shifts and things, and, people are getting out their sweaters and that kind of stuff. But one of the things I like to do is think about what people do all around the world to celebrate this. And I did want to just talk a little about one of my favorites, which is the Chinese Moon Festival. And I really was struck by this because someone in the down at Winslow Green has hung these beautiful paper lanterns on their little patio, their little balcony. And so in the evening, you see these beautiful floating, it's like pastel moons. They're really lovely. And it inspired me to get some of my own. And I thought it's kind of not as flashy as the Christmas lights or something like that, but it's soft and beautiful. And they do look like big, beautiful pastel moons. And I thought, what a lovely way to kind of say we're kind of easing into the next season, right? And I personally love those sort of fall autumn colors. One of the things I start doing is collecting leaves all over the place, because you can see them, they're really starting to change now. There's actually a cool app that tells you how to track whether the peak of color all over the country, which is kind of cool too, right? So you can I'll see if I can bring it up, and maybe Reed can put it on the
Sure, I can put it up if you send me the link or put it in
yep,
the chat.
that's what I'm going to do. But it is kind of wonderful that you can set it for anywhere in the country, and you can set the day and the time, and it will tell you what even though it says Smoky Mountains, don't be fooled, it actually covers the whole country. So I've got it now, and I'm going to capture it and put it in the chat. Yeah. So it's kind of fun because so many times people say, oh, I planned this wonderful vacation so I could go see the leaves, and then they weren't that good. It's like, well, because of that, really interestingly, a lot of rural communities depend on the leaf crowd, right? The summer people are gone. These little communities out in the boonies are like, they got nothing. And so it's really nice to be able to say, they have leaf tourism is a big boom, right? So this map is kind of sweet. Yeah, and if you scroll down a little bit, you see that at the bottom, I don't know if you can scroll down on that. No, just under the map itself, there's a, where'd it go? There's a bar just a little bit down, and you push it to show the date. And as you switch the date, right, here's the date switch, and then it shows you where the color is and where it's moving to. It's actually awesome. And so if you're planning a trip and you really want to see what it's going to look like, this is a great way to follow those leaves. I remember on several cross-country drives being like in the zone for the whole way. It's amazing. Like you got to track autumn across the entire country. It's a beautiful, really fun way to plan a vacation around this really extreme event that a lot of people don't have a deep understanding of it because it isn't really part of their background. But for me, growing up in New England, I heard about this stuff like since forever, right? And the things that make for interesting leaf color, like the powerful leaf color, some of it's stuff that you would pretty much expect. Weather obviously has a lot to do with it, right? And but soil moisture is something that a lot of people are not as tuned into. I think that because we don't get much summer rain, sometimes the color can be really disappointing here. But if you want to build color, that's one thing to think about, is like to keep on doing at least minimal watering in your garden, for especially things like Japanese maples are really sensitive to soil moisture, and they can really struggle and not show on the fabulous color that you probably bought them for, right? So making sure that soil moisture is even, doesn't have to be extreme. They don't need to be soaked, but they need to have regular, reliable moisture. That builds, and also compost. Of course, you knew I was going to talk about compost, but compost builds the natural sugars, the bricks that plants use to store sugars in their leaves usually, and also in flowers to some extent. And those natural sugars are actually part of, create the pigments that create the color. And so as the weather, like as the nights grow longer and cooler, that signals the leaves. It's like the trigger to them to start getting ready to fall off, so they start pushing chlorophyll back into the twigs where it's stored to be used by the tree or shrub over the winter, right? And as the chlorophyll drains out, the green, all of a sudden you start to see these cool colors. And what they are is the sugars. And now a lot of those sugars have also been drained into the tree. But in autumn, one of the things that happens is as the leaves age, their veins get constricted. So as they're a little bit narrow, they can't pull the sugars out as fast. And the autumn,
I've heard about that in all kinds of species.
yeah, it's true. It's yeah, shut up. It's what happens though is that the sugars build in the autumn because we get the warm sunny days if we're lucky, and then the cool nights, and that traps the sugars, right? So these new autumn sugars are going to be the color palette that's going to be the blazing ones. And what I think is so interesting is that's the same stuff that's in our vegetables, right? So you have the carrot stuff like carotenoids that makes bananas yellow, it makes carrots orange, right? Daffodils, all that kind of stuff, rutabagas, bananas, everything. That's what brings out the oranges, yellows, and the deep rich browns in a lot of leaves. And then for the brilliant reds and the maroons and that kind of coppery bronze, that's the anthocyanins that like puts the blue in blueberries, right? It also um, colors up things like apples and grapes and all that kind of stuff. And because they're water soluble, they get held in the sort of watery liquid of the leaf cells, and then that's why they sort of glow and shine, right? And I just thought it was kind of fascinating that we have the same things in our leaves as we do in our vegetable bin, right? It's
It's
cool.
neat. Yeah. And so, when you talk about keeping the leaves as close to where they fall,
Mhm.
is that because that all those good things in the leaves are good for the plant in
Yeah,
some other way?
right. Because in nature, like nature has a plan, it's not just dropping its hanky and hoping somebody will pick it up, right? It's like all those leaves are full of nutrients specifically designed to get that plant through the next 6 months, right? Until it can start putting new leaves out and producing um, photosynthesis and storing that chlorophyll again. So when we tidy that up, we actually, and it doesn't really matter. You can put compost down and that's really good. But even better is to put shred the leaves if you don't like the look of them, but put the leaves back and not around the throat. That's not really where they can use it. You put it out like at the drip line of the tree because that's where their active feeding roots are busy and that's where they can do the most good. So if you kind of spread the bed or around each tree, make sure that you have worked some compost into that area, but also that's where the shredded leaves belong. And if you have a big lot and you're still mowing, mow the leaves and just leave them there and they will break down really beautifully and you won't see a thing. And they'll also help aerate your soil because that kind of composting on site, like actually is a soil healer that will mean you don't get red thread, you don't get molds and mildews, you don't get a lot of the problems that start happening when the soil is depleted. So leave the leaves, but you don't have to leave them intact, right? And once they're shredded, they don't seem to blow around as much. They get heavy pieces, and as soon as they're shredded, they have all those opportunities for little bacteria to start working on them. So they break down a whole lot faster. which is what you.
Right, so they may not turn I mean, I don't have lovely grass, but they may not turn the grass you have into mud if they're all breaking down and sort of, as you said, aerating the
Right.
soil.
Yeah, they don't smother the lawn, but really trees shouldn't have lawn under them anyway. Really, that is not optimal. So think about, if you have that big lawn with big, lots of room, then every tree should be surrounded by a bed that's full of things like epimedium, a ground cover that doesn't need much of anything and is evergreen. There's different kinds or different sizes. But you can have basically a no mow, no go zone, and then you won't. What the biggest cause of death for trees in lawns is actually weed whacker damage. Just saying, people get in there, I'm going to tidy that sucker up, and of course, whack, 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 um, and that is really makes a lot of problems because trees' vascular system depends on an intact bark, and if you don't have that, you have problems. Sometimes you'll see that in a tree that, like, one whole section will be losing its leaves early or just start dying back, and if you look at the tree, you can see that under it, at the bottom, there's probably a big scar from something, right? A mower incident or a weed whack incident, whatever.
Well, the other thing that I like about this is I've been trying to take pieces of this ramshackle lawn and turn it into garden. And this is a kind of an easy way to take another chunk out.
Right.
Just to say, yeah, I won't, I'll just make another garden there and I'll be good for the tree and me.
Well,
and the birds and the bees.
Right. And the pollinators and the whole thing. If you think about a shady lawn, especially kind of like yours is fairly shady and tiered, right? You've got this little slope there. Well, if you can eliminate mowing entirely, you would have a habitat that'd be really attractive. Now, the thing about that is in this part of the world, if you don't mow at all, what starts to happen is you begin to develop a climax forest basis, like the pioneer trees will come up. Well, you don't really want that. So you do want to at least mow or weed whack at least once a year and maybe twice. But leaving everything where it is means that you're feeding that and replenishing the soil. You're not robbing and depleting it. And it doesn't eliminate the need for compost in a lot of situations because often our native soils are very nutritious in terms of minerals, but they're pretty light in terms of humus. And so one of the things that happens in a climax forest, of course, is all that stuff drops out, rots down in place, and builds up this beautiful stuff called duff, forest duff. That's like rich, amazing, and supports, as you know, if you go out and look in the woods, everything from tiny slime molds to gigantic, 500-foot tall firs. So that rich soil depends on being replenished every year. And in our yards, if we're tidying stuff up, we're not doing the replenishing we need to. And a little handful of granulated something, fertilizer, that's not the same. It's not feeding the soil. So we have to do both those things. And one of the things to really think about now is we're in drought. We're not in the extreme drought we've been in the last few years, but we are still in official state of drought in this part of Washington state. And so everything we do to heal the soil and help the soil hold moisture means that we're helping our big trees, our big plants, our long-term plants to survive better in really tough situations.
And you're saying that there's a way to live in harmony that doesn't require living in the middle of a climax forest.
It's true.
That we can kind of negotiate with nature a little bit.
Absolutely. But there's also this really fascinating Japanese botanist, biologist who has developed what he calls tiny forest concepts. And so people all over the world, like I was just reading about this guy in India who's actually an engineer and a tech guy, but he read about that. He went out in his backyard, which was 75 square meters. Okay, whatever. So not very big. He planted 229 saplings of all kinds of trees, which is pretty crazy extreme, right? He watered them. And what he found is like within a year, they were all growing really strong. And that the rain, instead of pooling and running off like it always had been, started sinking in. Some things did really well. Some things died. Some things won, but the rich mixture, immediately he started having birds. He started seeing, all kinds of plant life in this very small space. And that's the theory of this tiny forest is like, if you don't feel like you're really using your property entirely, you could consider taking a section of it and making a tiny forest and handing it over to the wildlife. And it could be a strip along driveway, those long Bainbridge driveways, right? Well, Either side could become tiny forests, right? And they would sort themselves out over time. I don't recommend planting 229 saplings per whatever that amount of space
It's
is.
just emailing me.
Much.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering about the idea, when you're doing that, obviously in the forest, trees can grow pretty close into each other's world. They look like they're competing or they have funny looking shapes because they're growing on top of each other. You can allow that. That's okay. You're
Yeah.
not, we don't need all our evergreens to look like Christmas trees.
No, and the thing that's really interesting is you'll look in a mature forest of hardwoods. So not necessarily like we have so many evergreens here, but we also have a lot of deciduous trees. And if you look at them, you'll notice if you look over the top of the forest, like when you're driving down a hill, you'll see that they all have a discrete crown, and that's called being crown shy. They know trees don't overlap each other. Like as they grow up together, they give each other space. And underneath that, there'll be young ones coming up, and they wait till somebody falls over and dies and opens a window, and then boom, they start putting on. You can have a very small tree that has enough rings to show you that it might be 50 years old. It's been waiting a really long time. And sometime a big windstorm comes, or there's too much ivy on the mom and it gets blown over, boom, all of a sudden these young ones take off and they have a lot of stored nutrients and a lot of deep roots. And
It's
so
like the Democratic Party right now.
well, please, let us, it's
Waiting,
cool. I mean,
waiting for some of the old oak to make way.
I feel like I've been saying for my entire life, a generation needs to pass along. But in the forest, that's a good metaphor. It's true. And as they move by, you get this new stuff coming up. But people with a yard big enough could do really well to just like, every year you can go get small rooted seed saplings of various kinds of things from the Department of Natural Resources. You pick them up at the fairgrounds. They're really inexpensive. It's like a bundle of 10 is $5 or something like that. And you can pack them in, and you could really heavily plant some depleted area and let them duke it out and have a natural environment that you'll be a bird sanctuary. In 2 years, you'll have something there. And not everybody will thrive, but the ones that do will create their own habitat. It's cool.
That is really exciting, and it takes these little spaces that can really provide oases for all the things that we want to encourage.
Exactly. And when you think about all the lawns in America that are just absolutely dead zones for any kind of diversity, even, anywhere you have these little strips of grass along, like, don't do that. Put something alive there and let it create habitat. And when you're tidying up, I always want to say this, like, remember that 85% of bee species, native bee species, we have 400 bee species in Washington state. Quite a lot of them are on the coast. 85% of those are going to be ground dwelling or living in, say, a stump or the old grass or an old stem of something, right? So every time we do these massive sweeps and cleanups, you are taking out maybe hundreds of thousands of little bees. Now, one thing about leaving stuff in place, like doing the chop and drop, like you can chop it and then let it drop, that actually is less disturbing because a lot of times they're still in there, right? And so maybe the grass isn't up right now, it's lying flat, doesn't really matter. They'll still be okay. Or you haven't dug up or you haven't tilled the soil, which bees remember. They actually have very powerful ability to remember where they are safe, where the good food is and stuff like that. A lot of them never travel more than a quarter mile in their lives. So if you create safe zones for them, they'll boost the population of all these beneficials because you're not disturbing it. You have to disturb it, like I said, once or twice a year to make sure that you don't turn it into a population of young alders, blackberries, and, wannabes like giant cedars or something. You can only have so many, but the little stuff, yeah, you can let it
Messed up and took some.
create a
Great.
population.
Yeah, that's cool. So this is one of those times where probably as we're transitioning from one season to another, where we're starting to look at, okay, a good time to spread some of that. There certainly are plenty of leaves to chop up and other kinds of compost too, right?
There are, and again, the more diversity of nutrients you can offer your plants, your garden, your space, the more wholesome and healthy that soil will be, and the more it will help everybody. So having like there are neighborhoods where people bag the leaves and put them out to get taken away. What are you even thinking? So I have been for years, I'll go get them, right? And take them and bring them back and spread them. One of the best ways to control a big weedy mess is to deep mulch of leaves. Like a foot is not too much. 18 inches is not too much. You can put it down, and then to keep it in place, you can use coarse bark, shredded, not bark, shredded wood chips, and put that over the top. And that will anchor the leaves. And as it all rots down, it's going to open the soil and turn it into
Reading ever.
amazing.
I can go to Tills or somewhere and say, I want chopped up wood. I want your leftover, or is that?
It's coarse wood chips. And you know, the tribe has it too. And, on 305. You can get a lot of those places will have various grades. You can get fine wood chips, medium wood chips. The biggest stuff is called hog fuel. And that works great if you have an area that's like sort of towards the woods or you're not really walking there much. It's big, but over time it will also rot down, and it makes a very healthy soil environment. And it's really good for areas where there's already a lot of big trees. You don't want to create too much soft soil there, but the big hog fuel is great for transition areas. You can use it as paths, right? And there'll be big chunks of stuff in there, but that's okay, because over time, that's all going to break down and bring a lot more to the party, right?
That's
Good. And you don't need that so-called beauty bark. It's really ugly.
Right. The thing about bark is it's nutrient poor and it sheds water, right? And it actually does require some nitrogen as it breaks down, which it takes out of the soil. Now, granted, it will put it back eventually, but in the meantime, I'm sure everybody has seen those little shrubs surrounded by ugly bark, and they're yellow because they're so stressed out, and they're struggling and suffering because they're not getting enough water, they're not getting enough nutrients. If you rake the bark away, you can use that on a path if you really, really have to, but put in compost instead, and maybe put some granulated humic acid down first. Humic acid is one of the components of compost that really helps open soil and create a better soil texture and allow better letting more air in and more moisture both in and out. In other words, it doesn't lock the moisture in the way heavy clay would do, but it opens it up so there's a nice exchange of water and air. And roots need both. They also do need some air.
Mm-hmm. Humic acid in sprinkling form?
Well, you can get it as liquid or you can get it as granules. And I just use the granules and scattered around. I mean, they'll tell you a rate. I don't think it really matters that much. I throw it like chicken feed, you just kind of scatter it around. And it's just like my pea patch that I inherited had all the soil taken away. So it's subsoil, which was not very nutritive and not open at all. So I started putting down the humic acid, and then I put compost on that, and I put a lot of leaves on that, and I put more wood chips on that, and I put more, and kept layering on. And now, like in the third year, it's starting to open up and be soil, right? But leaving as much of it intact as possible is really helpful.
Really, comment?
So now I have not a challenge, an opportunity to have a different kind of little garden, because I just have a little deck. And I've always wanted, I kept asking, I want a place with sun, and I have sun. So next summer I will have some beautiful little tomatoes, but I have to decide what I'm going to put up there.
Right.
And not too much. And so Anne took a look at it this morning.
And a lot of people have, like what you have, a balcony like that. And there's some really different things, like do not plant a tiny forest on your balcony. One of the things you have to think about is, like, when you're gardening on the ground, you don't have to worry about how heavy is this pot. Right. What if the pot blows over? When you're up on a balcony like that, you have to think about, if this pot gets knocked over and breaks and falls down, it could really hurt somebody, right? So you have to start rethinking the way you organize. And like, when a pot has soil and moisture in it, and then plants and plant roots, it becomes really heavy. So instead of having a ceramic pot, a beautiful, nice clay pot or glazed pot, you might think about switching over to the ones that they're light, they're plastic, but they look just very neutral. And there's a lot of those they're serviceable. They last a very long time. but they're not heavy in themselves, so that when you put all this other additional weight in them, you're not doubling the weight, right? Does that make sense? And
Right,
so and there you always want to make sure, because you're up and you're not in the, in the ground at all, you want to make sure that you're not wrecking your deck, right? So you want to have a big deep saucer, and you want the saucer to be on feet of some kind. And there's a lot of things that will lift it up. I mean, I've used chunks
Right.
of tube before, but there's nicer looking ones. And Rita, I know
Yeah.
you will find something pretty, but get it up so there's air exchange from underneath. They're
Right.
sitting on a saucer. You can lift them off the saucer too, so that there's air, there's exchange. The saucer isn't flat. A lot of them have like a molded bottom, so that gives some ability for drainage and air to. And when
Right.
you water in those situations, you want to make sure if there's standing water, you can like use a turkey baster to suck it up and get it out, because you don't want mosquitoes and stuff living um, in your little oasis up there. But yeah, you think about wind, and you think about what can fall off. You have to think about a lot of things in a really different way. And also thinking about the volume of soil, because in a hot balcony that's got all the sun like you have now, small containers are going to dry out in a nanosecond.
Right.
And that is a pain. It's really hard. And the ones, there's cute little things that hang over the edge of your railing. They're adorable. They have very little root space. And so only things that don't need much root space are going to be very successful there. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of things like that.
5 pansies or something, right? They
Well,
could,
you could do sedums and succulents, which are fun.
Right.
Things
Yeah.
like that, but you don't want anything that's got a lot of volume, because it needs equal amount of root space, and then it's going to either fall off, break, or whatever, just not do well, right?
Right.
So, you're better off with a few big pots, and you can even do like a mini tiny forest. Like if you get a big enough pot, a mother pot, they call them, the Asian ones, they're really large and beautiful. Those can become a little ecosystem, but
Right.
you want to make sure everything in there is relatively compatible. But because you've got the depth now, you can do stuff like layering bulbs in.
Right.
Digging deep, they'll come up and do their thing, and then having something to spill over the side, like the golden creeping jenny is really pretty, or some of the evergreen euonymus trailing like emerald and gold or whatever. Those are pretty.
Right.
And then you want something upright and big that's not too root intense, but some of the smaller grasses that will be 2 feet and kind of spilly, that would be perfect. They won't get too huge, and they won't take over the whole pot and crowd everything else out. And then one of the things I like to do with those big pots is put in empty pots that are space holders. So you can drop in a little pot of miniature daffodils, and when they're done, take them out. And then you drop in some pansies or whatever you like, take them out, drop in petunias, and they do their thing. And that way you're not digging the roots up and disturbing the root, but you can
Oh,
even
that-
have a tiny little espalier tree or something like that.
Right.
Then you have to put it closest to the wall of the building, not out on the edge of the balcony. I'm just saying, these are things I have learned. Because you want to make anything that's going to be heavy like that needs to be close to the building, so that less away from the wind, and putting the weight on the strut, on the weight bearing parts. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So you have some permanent thing, like maybe it's not really a tree, but it's something like a little standard rose or standard hydrangea, right? And then underneath you've got some spillers, and you can change those out too by having these empty pots. And one of the things that I learned is like, figure out what kind of pots most of the places you shop at have. Are they round or are they square? Because if all your sinkers are round and everything you can buy is square, you got another choice. You can put more round pots and save those, and repot whatever your square thing is into that. Does that make sense?
Right.
And then you can still pop it out, but you have to sort of think about.
And I've got a million pots over at the Adventure House that I have
Right.
turned over different sizes, and of course you've got a million as well. So.
Right. Exactly. But it's something that you wouldn't necessarily think of until
Right.
you go,
Exactly.
oh, this doesn't work.
Yes. Exactly.
But
And
the
I
idea
and
is
it was
you can have
said-
that. You can have that seasonal flow and not disturb the roots of the things that are more permanent plantings.
Right. And then I was thinking when you said about the pots, well, I can just get some stuff to spill over the edge of them to kind of, soften up that edge. And so you just don't know so you don't really see the most
You
of the
don't see
pot.
them at all, right? Exactly.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so I can do that. So I'm very excited about having a little deck patio.
Well, and even for you, this is a cool time to do that.
I know that Karen King and Bob King have also done things like blueberries. I mean, there's some interesting things you can do on your
Oh, yeah,
patio.
exactly.
One advantage is you can actually do things like grow carrots on a balcony that will never get the the little carrot worms because they don't go
Oh,
that high. There's a lot of little pests at ground level that don't ever get up to the second story, third story balcony. So which is kind
right.
of great, right? So and the baby carrots, you can grow those in a deep pot really, really well and have like little fresh salads and stuff. That's fun.
Right.
And keep that going. And this is a good time of year to start looking like herbs. If there are herbs that you really like to use a lot, they're often on sale right now. And you can think about how big is this going to get? Make sure you read the directions because some of the rosemaries, for instance, want to be 6 feet tall.
Yeah.
Others are fillers that are going to hang over the side, right? Like Irene is that really pretty one that you can see kind of cascading.
Yes, it's lovely.
Yeah. But think about wind too, because you're going to probably
Okay.
get some buffeting wind up there.
Yeah, okay. So we'll
You'll
talk
see
about,
how this first winter goes. You'll start to get a sense of like, what, yeah, there's sun, but is there also wind or whatever? You'll see where the pattern is. Does the rain get all the way there or does it get blown around and not really get in? And that's the other thing that's kind of cool. There's some fun hoses that will hook to your kitchen sink and are flexible, those flexi hoses. And then you can pull it out to the balcony, and water out there without having to refill your little pot a million times. But that you can do that too, whatever.
right. Okay, it's gonna be exciting. We need to
Yeah.
see this deck is gonna be, and I think in the one corner and between the chairs, I've got a pot there with something, but that gets lots of sun and that would be a nice place to put something kind of tall, I think.
Mhm.
Or something to kind of, so we'll look at that.
Yeah, and it's fun. And the thing that's fun about a small balcony is it forces you to make some choices.
Right.
You have to kind of pick and choose, but you can also circulate things and change it up.
Yeah, exactly. So that is going to be very exciting to do. So thank you. Those are things to think
Yeah.
about.
I
That's
also
fun to have a new project.
right? Oh, it's like playing house. It's totally fun.
Right.
I wanted to talk a little about like what to do in the garden if you are growing vegetables, for instance, because this is kind of that swing season. A lot of stuff is kind of aging out. The tomatoes are kind of giving it up. And this is a great time to do like slow roasting your tomatoes, 225 for like a couple hours. I put a little avocado oil, which is a very high temp and doesn't singe or burn and has a nice neutral flavor, and just rub everything and cut the tomatoes in half. I usually do them cut side down. A lot of people do them cut side up. It doesn't really matter, but it's like they caramelize a little bit when you do them cut side down, which I really love the deepness of that flavor. And then freeze it, right? Put it in little containers, freeze it, and then you can add that to soups and salsas and sauces and all kinds of stuff in the winter, and it's really nice. Because at this point, most of the tomatoes are pretty well done with their ripening thing. They're, not, you may get a little more, but it's kind of on the edge. And so pulling those out, beans are sort of getting finished. So harvesting those, again, you can just blanch them really quickly and freeze them. Or I do a lot of mixes where I'll like put a zucchini through the Cuisinart and grate it and have grated zucchini, grated beans, grated whatever, squash, onions, and then freeze that whole combination. I don't blanch them because I'm going to use them pretty fast, like within a month or two. But there you go, have instant soup practically, right? So freezing a mix of things, because you know how you go to the garden, you got 6 beans and a handful of this and a little bit of basil and a little bit of this and 1 pepper. Just zoop it all together and I just grate everything, right? And then it freezes really nice. And those big zucchinis, they're great to do that with. Like do a whole one, and then you can do the Julia Child. What is that? Gratin, zucchini au gratin. She has this great recipe, which is kind of strange because it says press all the juice out of the zucchini and then add water. I'm like, why would you do that? So I don't. So I just don't press this. I don't add water and I don't press the zucchini. I just let it the natural vegetable juices, and then you cook it with like raw rice and sauteed onion and raw rice, and then you throw it with the zucchini, and I think you can do milk or milk substitute or whatever, and you bake it, and it turns into this beautiful sort of custardy, but it doesn't have eggs, which is nice for some people who don't do eggs. But there's that kind of stuff. You can have it not just 2 months of the year, but you can have it later because you can freeze those big guys you shred them into those long shreds. Perfect. And that you can do that if you like zucchini bread too, which, a lot of people do.
No. And you don't have to eat it all right now.
Exactly, because that's one of the things where people are like, do not show me another zucchini. But later they might really like that, right? And before you replant the ground, even if you've been watering assiduously, which, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, the ground is pretty wasted and depleted and it's been dry. And it's dry like 2 inches from where you were watering. So anything we do kind of gets sucked out, right? Like wicks away pretty quickly. So before you start thinking about what autumn starts you want to replace, think about repairing and restoring that soil, putting down, again, some granulated humic acid, putting down a layer of compost. Um, I've been using more and more of these medium grind wood chips that are like the whole tree, arborist chips, as a top dressing, especially in an open, sunny, exposed area, because it really locks in the moisture and it keeps it from getting wicked away by wind. And in windy sites, which, we're coastal, we do get quite a bit of offshore wind, that can be really taking a lot of nutrients and whisking a lot of moisture out of the soil. So once you reprep the bed and it's all nice, then you can start thinking about, and the whole point of this too is that you have to hydrate the entire bed, not just water in one little spot where you're putting in I don't know, leak. You have to make sure that the matrix is moist all the way. So that requires not just like hand watering, but really maybe putting a small sprinkler on. There's those little teeny bubblers you can get. They're like $6 or something. And they can make a big spray, but you can set them low. And then they make a small focused spray and you can move that around a little bit. And then you're slowly watering it in and it's absorbed and not just running off all over the place. And that way you can really wet it down, put on the compost, wet it down, put on the chips, wet them down. And now you have a wet sandwich, which is actually going to be a much better matrix for whatever you want to stick in. But this is a great time to do more greens. This is a great time for kale. Some of the winter hardy lettuces, and there are quite a few of those. A lot of the bib types will make it through. The romaines, really good for a lot of winter, the next few months for sure. Kales will make it usually through till spring and do just fine, especially if they've been put into nice refreshed soil and not asked to take over an abandoned site that's already had a lot of good stuff sucked out of it, right? Some years we have no idea what this year is going to be like, but some years I get a second pea crop that's as good at snow peas or those quick ones where you're pod peas, right? Avalanche is a good one. Oregon Spring, a lot of times we'll do a nice second crop. So it's worth a try. You're not out anything. And if they win, if you get a few nice meals of snow peas, there you go. It's worth it, right? Besides, the packages usually have way more than you need in the spring and the same ones you can use again in the fall.
There you go. So you can get it started and try again.
Yeah.
If we end up with inclement weather.
Well, and peas are tough. Like they come through a lot of cold, so they don't mind that as much as some other plants do. And of course, they're nitrogen fixers, so they're pulling their own fertilizer out of the air, and they're less dependent than certain other kinds of things. Lettuces are going to want a little help. So, like some of those Dr. Earth fertilizers that are kind of low numbers, and you just scratch them in and then put the compost and stuff on top. That will keep those lettuces and things going nicely. Leeks is another one that I like to put it in. And then they start fattening up around the winter holidays, which is when you want them. And if you wait until they've been frosted just a little bit, they develop much richer, more interesting palate. They become just slightly sweeter. And so you get the bite and the sweetness. Nice balance.
Can I put garlic in for next year now?
Definitely you can. Some people wait until like between Christmas and New Year's. And for some people, that's the traditional time. It's been pretty iffy and it's been frozen the last few years. So I'm just saying autumn is a great time to do that. And again, you want to refresh the soil first. And always when you're doing that, you want to use organic garlic, which you can get at the grocery store, but use the biggest, fattest cloves, not the little skinny ones, because they are not going to make big, fat, beautiful heads, right? The biggest cloves are going to make the biggest, best heads. And then all the little ones you save and you just throw them in soup. right? Or when you're boiling a chicken bones.
Or if you're roasting vegetables, they're small enough, they can just they'll caramelize and you'll hardly notice that they don't taste
Right.
like garlic.
Yep. Or, if you just peel them and put them in with, and if you just push the flat of a knife down on top of any kind of garlic, it will pop kind of unseal the skin, and then it will pop right off nicely. But if I'm putting them in, like I'm boiling down bones or something, I'll just throw them in with their skin and all, or cut them in half maybe, and then they just kind of cook
And then
down.
you'll pull them out when you're pulling the other stuff out.
I pull most of it out and strain it, so it's all good, right? You can put in things like the tops of carrots or the tails, rutabagas or whatever. Just kind of make a mix.
I'm getting hungry.
Yeah, I know, right? But that's a good thing to do with things like the when you do tops and tails on beans and things. They're perfectly good. We just don't usually eat them, but they are fine for it. So you can freeze batches of that kind of stuff too when you're doing a broth, and then throw in the top of the onion and the the little garlics and the tops and
Yeah,
tails.
the stuff that I'm putting in the compost. I can
Right.
get one more round out of it.
Yeah, well, and the bottom of the celery, or if you cut the tops off, some people do. I just always freeze that stuff and then have a little box, and you just throw stuff in there. And then when you're ready to do a big broth, boom. And that adds a lot of nice complexity to whatever broth you want to make.
Okay, any more thoughts before we wrap up? I know we're going to have a kind of a
Oh.
similar conversation on Monday as we revisit braiding sweetgrass, which is a neighboring topic to this,
Really is.
obviously.
There is one more thing I meant to mention, and it's that several people said to me they were going to go buy stuff at the nursery, but they didn't want to buy perennials that had been cut back because they looked like they weren't good. And I was like, no, that's fine. What you want to make sure is, like, if you're looking at them, there are a lot of times they're on a good sale in the fall too. Just gently slip the plant out of the pot. And if the root systems look good and intact and strong, that plant is great. You were going to cut it off anyhow, right? So don't fuss that it's been cut off at the nursery. It's a really good time to stock up on, like, some of the hardy herbs, some of the perennials and things that you've been looking at and maybe you didn't buy because they were pretty pricey. Maybe this is a really good time to go buy them, and don't worry again about buying something that's cut back. As long as the root system is intact and healthy looking, you're good.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for every month coming and sharing these things with us. I really appreciate it.
Well, and what's fun for me is seeing that I know that people look at them after, and I know people are
Yes.
in the middle of the day. So I'm glad to do it. And I, always welcome questions. If people want to email questions to you or me or whatever, we'll take it from there.
Great. And in the description box under this YouTube, there's the link to your blog.
Oh.
And that's great. And then I also, of course, enjoy reading you in the paper.
Yeah, right. But that's my community service.
This is your community service too. You're just
Oh,
all
there's a
about
lot of
community
community
service.
It is. What could be more satisfying than taking your lifetime of self-education and then pouring it back out so other people can benefit? Like, that's just great, right?
Well, thank you. Thank you.
You are welcome. And you're right. I hope everybody will tune in Monday and join. You don't have to have read the book, by the way. A lot of people have said, oh, I'd love to be on that, but I haven't really read it. It's like, that's okay. You come and listen, and maybe it will whet your appetite to dig in a little bit, because the
Yeah,
book is.
join us on Zoom or come by the Senior Center 1:30 on Monday. We have a posting at the Senior Center and online and at the library. You'll see them all over the place. The library is doing a reading of Braiding Sweetgrass, or a discussion around it. We're doing a series of sessions on the sections.
And I think Islandwood is offering some guided walks.
Yes, and there's a note about that in our atrium bulletin board.
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways to get involved, and it's great. And this is not a fast read book. So if you buy it, you don't get through it, don't worry about it. Just dip in now and again. For me, it's one of the most encouraging things to read when I'm feeling a little down about the world. Dip in and you will come out feeling like it's so hopeful and so beautiful.
Yes, and I feel like each chapter is totally its own lovely bouquet of information.